All right. Hello, everybody. Good evening if you're in Europe. Good afternoon, late, or I guess also maybe evening, or yeah.
Wait, is there sound?
Good afternoon in New York, and also an earlier afternoon in LA. So we have the UK covered and Los Angeles covered by Tony Funky Cole Medina, and our special guest Garrett from the Social Populist. He is coming to us from the East Coast. So anyway,
Wait, what the hell?
yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and we can. So,
Let's
welcome to the
try.
Morbid Symptoms podcast. Tony, I can hear you, so you may
Tara, I don't
want
know
to
if you
mute.
can hear me, but there's no sound coming in.
No, can you hear me, Garrett?
Yes.
Okay, so we can hear you. Okay, hold on. I'm just going to remove him. Sorry, sorry, Tony. um, anyway, sorry. So, my co-host was having technical difficulties, so I'm just going to drop him down. Let's see if he comes back up. Tony, can you hear us? Tony, can you hear us?
Shit.
Okay, well, we don't want to hear that. All right. So, anyway, sorry about that. Things happen. So, this is the Morbid Symptoms podcast. I think this is episode 8. And tonight we're going to be debating the topic of the left, Hamas, and socialism. And it's kind of a bit of an interesting debate because we're going to debate or we're going to comment on in real time a previously recorded podcast by the Catrone Zone on Sublation Media, where they were talking about what a leftist or an appropriate left or socialist understanding of Hamas in general and the attack and the raid on October 7th. And myself and also Garrett have some criticisms and quite a different understanding or take on this topic. Okay, so right before we start, I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to see if Tony has worked out his problems. Tony,
Yeah,
can you hear us?
yeah, I can
Can you
hear
hear
you.
us?
Yeah, I can hear you
Okay.
perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Because we could hear you, but you couldn't hear us. So
Great.
I guess
Yeah.
I guess next time that happens, I'll I don't know what I'll do. I'll do a Carol Burnett ear thing so you know that I can hear you, but you can't hear me. Okay. So um, anyway, we're pleased to have a special guest with us tonight, Garrett Ramirez from the Social Populist. Garrett, is there anything you'd like to say before we start looking at the Catrone Zone episode on Hamas, the left, and socialism?
Um, well, just thank you for having me, and I'm glad you appreciate the social populist on Substack. Yeah, I probably haven't read as much Lenin and Trotsky and Marx as Chris Cutrone has, but I don't think you need to read that much to know he's misrepresenting them.
No, yeah. So we'll get into that. Yeah. So again, and just on the screen here, you can see Garrett's last, I think, most recent Substack on Cornel West, Jimmy Dore, and inevitability of Fred Hampton leftism, with the subline or the subheadline, "Cultural nationalism still casts a shadow over revolutionary rainbows." And I'm pleased to announce that maybe Monday, but in the near future, we'll be having Garrett back on to focus on this topic here, how cultural nationalism still casts a shadow over revolutionary rainbows, with reference to, of course, Cornel West and Jimmy Dore, but also, if I remember correctly, you were comparing Stokely Carmichael and
Fred
Fred
Hampton.
Hampton. Okay, yeah. So these two.
He was the originator of the Rainbow Coalition.
Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to that. I skimmed that article and I was like, okay, there's a lot here. I'll have to go. We'll go over it again in more detail before we bring you back on to discuss this really interesting topic. And as well. All right. So some background. Oops. Sorry. Yes. So about October 7th. No, sorry. That was back on October 7th. No. I think that this podcast, The Control Zone, that was on Sublation Media, so you can see Doug Lane there, who's the kind of the captain of the ship there on Sublation Media, and Chris Cutrone, who is, oh my God, my son just started the vacuum. Can you guys hear that too much?
No, you're
The
good.
vacuum? Okay, he always...
Sounds all right to me.
Okay, good. I don't know why he has to decide 10 minutes after I tell him I'm streaming to vacuum by my door. I guess I should be glad he's vacuuming. Anyway, sorry, audience and future audience. Oh, okay. Anyway, so I think this is about October 14th this came on. And I was really taken aback because I had been a long time a fan and supporter. I tuned in quite a bit to Doug Lane's Sublation Media, and also before that, I think he had Diet Soap. I had ended. It actually was a Patreon for a year or so, I think, and I actually ended my. I mean, I wasn't like a top tier Patreon, but I think a second tier Patreon, and I ended it not over this, but because of how they were totally. Their response to the gender ideology, so the transgender issue, so the gender versus sex issue, and how they seemed to be really staying away from as much as possible, and or treating it as just the right-wing culture war issue that only Matt Walsh and the religious right care about. And I knew better because I had known that there's lots of feminists. Socialists or otherwise, and women's rights activists, and also gay rights activists and whatnot, who've been trying to sound the alarm on the rights conflicts between transgender rights and disputing that term, and between also what that means for women's rights and gay rights. I don't want to get too off track, although we are having a guest come on next week who's writing a book called The Woke Commandments, and her and I are going to get deep into that. But so I was kind of back and actually had a bit of a back and forth with Doug a couple times online, and he was just really dismissive, just kind of making a joke about it, and even to the extent of like, well, what's the big deal if what's the big deal with mixed sex prisons and this type of thing. And I was a bit like, why shouldn't there be men in women's prisons? It's like, okay, but whatever. And so I thought, okay, he's just not taking this seriously, so that's fine. And then a bit later on,
many such cases.
Yeah. Sorry?
Many such cases of people on the left who ought to know better playing dumb on issues like that.
Yeah, this is the thing. It's just because it's safe, because it's just not because anyway. But yeah, so we're gonna not to get too off field because I could go on and on about that. And we have a guest, Anita. I think her last name's Bartholomew. I'm not sure. I can't remember. But anyway. She's written a book called The Woke Commandments, and it focuses a lot on, on gender, but not just gender. And her and I are going to get into that next week. But anyway, so it was one thing for me, for them to stay away from it, or to kind of pretend that they're dumb or that they really believe that, you can declare if you're a man or a woman and everything changes, or nothing changes. But then Ashley, I can't remember her name. Anyway, they had a person on, and they basically had an episode that was a rehash of the pink brain, blue brain argument. This idea that there's somehow, neurological evidence that something called the woman's brain could end up in a man's body, and this was just like, and then that was a step too far for me. I was like, okay, I gotta step back, because at any time so that's when I stopped. My minor protest is I stopped being a patron, although I kept on, I would watch episodes, but if you're not a Patreon, you only get, oftentimes they'll have the first hour, it's open to everybody, then only Patreons can see what they call the parrot room. And quite often I was interested in what his guests had to say, but I was like, okay, no. So I had already stopped being a Patreon, and then when this came on, and I had been a fan of Contrones, I'm not going to say I'm not anymore, but I really liked his take, the kind of historical longue durée of what he calls the death of the left, and this idea that really the left's been fairly dead since the early 30s in the States, and his and I don't know, sometimes you get this, if someone just there's just certain people that you just tend to believe what they say, especially if they're talking about something that you have a bit of knowledge on but not a lot, and they seem confident and it makes sense. So when he was talking about the Frankfurt School and this longue durée of Marxist theory, but also particularly Marxist politics. So I'm quite well read, and have also used Marxist theory in my own research on the urban the creative destruction that happens with real estate, the creation and rapid expansion of real estate markets in India. However, when it comes to the history of the political Marxism and the ins and outs of the Trotsky and Lenin and this and that, and what went on in the Soviet Union, what went on in different organizations in the U.S. and in the UK, I'm like, so I'm always happy when there's someone I can be like, okay, there's my resource on that, or these a couple of that. And so we'll see. I'm not gonna throw Chris under the bus, of course. And this is not my point of having Garrett on to go over this episode, is not to mount a cancellation campaign on Sublation Media, Chris Cutrone, not at all. Please go ahead and check them out. But I don't know what to make of this, because I really had a lot of regard for him in terms of his theoretical knowledge and his historical knowledge of political Marxism. But it's kind of hard when somebody gets something so wrong, then you kind of wonder, like, okay, is there something else there? But that's just, that could just be human nature.
Yeah.
So
I'll just like to say,
go ahead, Garrett.
As a point of introduction, maybe I should have said before, we're not just here to talk shit about Cutrone behind his back. We had an exchange with him on Twitter.
Yeah.
That's kind of how this started. So we've already had a debate with him.
Yeah. Well,
and I, for one, would say, if he wants to debate me, live, on video, audio, I'll do that as well. But we already came to him with this on Twitter.
Yeah, and also because I was mainly, and you'll see, we'll come back at the end of that. Maybe we'll come back at the end when we're done going through. We're not going to go through the whole thing. I don't think it's over an hour. But when we wrap up, we'll talk about maybe our interactions online and how he responded to those. He did respond, though. I was kind of surprised when he popped in. I was like, oh. But then I wasn't having it. I wasn't having any kind of flim flam, because again, I was,
Yeah.
I had my friends in Gaza and also some in Israel on my mind, so it was like, anyway. But that's about me.
It's not just an academic issue, as they say.
Yes, this is true. Anyway, my and the people who come across this, well, we're gonna watch. We're gonna respond in real time to it. Probably about half of it. But as I recall, because I haven't seen this, I watched this on October 14th, I think is when it came out. It's about 7 days after the Hamas raid that started off this latest round of the most violent episode probably since the Nakba in 1948. But my thing with it is that it was very one-sided, potted presentation. It was basically like, if we think about abstraction, it was basically from the point of view of like a typical Israeli point of view, is how I saw it, or kind of a typical kind of almost U.S. foreign policy, or he was saying things that Anderson Cooper would be saying. I thought, when it came to just the facts, how he was presenting, or how they were presenting, not just what happened on October 7th, what they thought happened, but just the conflict in general. And
Hamas is ISIS.
Sorry, go ahead.
Hamas is ISIS. Hamas is ISIS. Yeah, Hamas is ISIS.
And they're beheading babies, and they're high on meth and
high on meth. Yes.
Yeah, that was the one that was like a bridge too far. I was like, what? And then I wanted to be like, Chris, point to the Hamas doll where they hurt you. I mean, something has gone on here. And then I started thinking, like, what he was basing his, the factual thing. So, okay, of course, when they have Cutrone on, the Cutrone zone is basically going to give a Marxist political critique, or a Marxist critique of whatever topic is that they're talking about, and not just a theoretical one, but also a political one. So if you're a political Marxist, and Chris Cutrone thinks he's the last true political Marxist, The other people are nominally Marxist, will say, or maybe nominally politically Marxist, but that means something totally different or whatever. That's his thing. So you're going to get a kind of longue durée and a Marx theoretical critique and then a political analysis, perhaps. What are the political coordinates or opportunities or dead ends for in terms of building a socialism, or what he would call the dictatorship of the proletariat, that the task of political Marxists is to do what you can to bring about, to build what needs to be built in order to overthrow the dictatorship of capital and install the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a fancy way of saying it was a regime that's proletarian dominated, not capital dominated de facto or otherwise. So that's what you're going to get from Catrone, and that's fine. And we can talk about that as well. But and I have no problem with people having a specialty and applying that analysis to whatever comes along. But it's very important that the facts, that the case that you're applying it to, that you have your basic facts in order, or you're just going to be basically wittingly or unwittingly spreading disinformation. And there's actually people dying on the ground, being bombed and besieged at the moment. I think it's particularly incumbent, not just on the left, but anybody, not to talk out your ass. So that was my thing. And that, again, the kind of parroted Israel propaganda, I was just like, with no mention that, wait and see. So apparently on this, he's no longer he's no longer critical, or doesn't critical of the media on this issue. And then again, I've been talking about, and Tony and I have been talking about the last month or so, this Hamas derangement syndrome. Like, trying to understand, like, why would he, how to understand this caricature, this, I would say, almost kind of right-wing neocon description of Hamas in particular, and to some extent the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Like, what to make of this from the last Marxist, so to speak. And I just copied this from the Trump derangement syndrome, the phenomena that people who are normally quite measured or sensible or skeptical, when Trump's in any way involved, that all goes out the window. And I'm wondering if that's the same thing that kind of happens with Hamas, that for some reason, when Hamas is brought into it, all of a sudden it just, everything else just kind of goes to the background, and there's nothing, everything gets excused. But I don't know, because I'm not in Catrone's mind. I'm not in his psyche. But again, this was my my initial critique of this episode. And I think, yeah. So let me undo that. Is there anything you want to say before we start hearing this again? Maybe it's better the second time around. I don't know. I have my doubts, but we'll see.
Well, it's better because we know better. That's why it's.
Yes,
we're doing a little bit confused. We now know for a fact that he's wrong, but anyway.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Didn't mean to talk over you. Go ahead, Garrett.
But I'm ready.
Okay. Tony, anything you want to add?
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. So we're just going to start this, and then when he says something that I want to respond to, I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop it, and if he says something that, same for you, Garrett, just let me know if you want me to pause it. Okay? Sure. Okay, here we go.
Regardless of where it leads.
There we go. So welcome again to the Catrone Zone with the last Marxist, Chris Catrone, the only Marxist, according to Fakhri El-Sawadi, I think is how you say his name, who was just recently, yesterday, Monday, on the Socialism magazine stream to talk about the attacks by Hamas on Israel. And Chris, we're going to break from our usual routine of talking of maybe theoretically and, starting from your own writings. And I just want to talk to you about the current moment in politics. And I guess to start with, I'll just point out that even though I don't think the opinion that I'm seeing online from the majority of the leftists in my milieu reflect any kind of overall general consensus, if I didn't know that, I would think that the majority of people are very enthusiastic about Hamas and are perhaps even a little bit bloodthirsty when it comes to Israelis.
Yes. So first of all, I guess, I'll fulfill my my bad reputation as some kind of a leftist troll and say Happy Columbus Day.
Okay. Anyway, so I don't know who they're hanging out with, but that has not been my experience out in the wild and online, that people are bloodthirsty and are like totally like wearing their Hamas gear and waving their Hamas flags. Am I like, have you guys experienced what they're saying?
No.
No?
No,
Not
not
at
really.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so that right there, I was like, I mean, I don't know, again, I don't know their circles, but this idea that I'm, okay, so.
I mean, it all depends on how you interpret these things, because it depends on whether you buy the Israeli narrative of October 7th. The people who he would dismiss as bloodthirsty are probably just people who don't buy the Israeli Hasbara propaganda version of events. That Hamas are out for innocent blood.
Yeah. But even at this point, when because I don't know, that when those of us who've been through this rodeo before, who know that Israel lies but if it's about Palestinians, you have to assume it's a lie until proven otherwise, or at very least like a very one-sided. I mean, I would just say lie. I'm not the only one that says that. People who've covered it would say like these people, governments lie, and people and states that are at war lie, but these people lie more than anybody we've ever come across. So the idea that those of us have somebody been to this rodeo before, like, okay, we're not going to take anything that comes out of Israel at face value, and what tends to be repeated by government officials and State Department officials on the mainstream media channels. Well, like, this is what they want to, like, I'll listen to it and be like, okay, this is what they want us to think, but that is not what the case is. But it seemed like, they seem to be thinking, okay, the idea that was just a terrorist attack, they just came in, they wanted to kill all these people. And even with that, he's saying that people are like, yeah, I'm all for that. That I haven't. What I did hear.
If people want to know exactly what we're talking about, they can look at thegrayzone.com, which is run by Jewish Americans, and Electronic Intifada, which is run by Palestinians who aren't directly connected to Hamas. And they've exposed all this stuff using the Israeli press itself to say that most of the IDF's accounts are exaggerated or just plain false.
Mm-hmm. And right now, thank you for bringing that up, because I have a scroll here. Because when we're doing these podcasts and we're having a conversation, it's hard to stop and like we would if we're doing a regular paper and like cite our sources. But on the scroll here are just some people who I follow online, and it's various independent journalists, podcasters, and Twitter feeds that are quite good resources when it comes to not just particularly Israel and Palestine, but also Ukraine and all things foreign policy. But I'll leave up there for a bit. Okay, so far the three of us are saying we did not experience these people, bloodthirsty, rabid Hamas supporters baying for blood anywhere. Okay, if he can be hyperbolic, so can I. So let's see, let me find this thing. I need to share my screen, sorry. Here we go. Okay.
Related. So yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I'm notorious for, Israel-Palestine. and through a kind of maliciously hate-quoted, taken out of context statement from the internal listserv of Platypus that came like 100 emails into some discussion, and in which I was trying to address many different things at once. And I think Fakhri mentioned it, right? Because this is something that's been circulated. And so usually, though, the end of that email is not quoted, right? So it's posted somewhere and it's quoted in full, but then it circulates and people plant it on, there probably is just one loser who goes and plants it on every video of ours on YouTube.
That's not me, by the way.
Yeah, it's just like, it's the quotation of like, okay, this is for internal consumption, blah, 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 and the rational kernel of racism and this kind of thing. And so, but they don't get to the end. And I feel like maybe Fakhri himself had not seen the end, which is, I say, Israel-Palestine is an example of the failures of the 20th century, right? He did. So he said, I disagree with Chris Catrone that the path to liberation has to go through the state of Israel. And, I would agree with that, of course, because the state of Israel, what the hell is that? Because he says, Israel is a corrupt third world Bonapartist state. And it's as much a failure as any other third world developmental state, that only conjuncturally enjoys, the kind of, position that it has.
I just want to stop there because he says that he's famous for his position on Israel-Palestine. I have to say that I've been following him for a while, and this is the first time I ever heard him talk about it. But again, I'm not like a stalker. I haven't seen everything they've ever done. And also, do you know to what he means by Bonapartist? So, Garrett, is that something that you could say something about, or should I try to hydroplane my way through it? Just for our viewers who may not know.
Well, I'm not even sure he's using that correctly, because I think Bonapartism kind of refers to sort of a corrupted revolutionary position, and I guess being a strong man and being a proto-fascist, but it's one who comes out of a revolutionary situation. Was Israel originally a revolutionary state? Well, I mean, it was backed by the British Empire and then the American Empire, and was founded on ethno-nationalism, which is backwards, even by 20th century standards. So I think Bonapartism is giving them too much credit.
Okay, so I just wanted to, so.
Other than the fact that Netanyahu has now turned into a Napoleonic, strongman figure.
Okay. Yeah, yes, he needs, but he seems to be getting more casual though. I mean, he's just in these black shirts and pants. But okay, so let's see.
Black shirts. That's bad connotation.
It fits. I call him Zitler now, so I really am. Yeah, at some point I'll have to rein my indignation in, but I'll wait till the bombs stop. Okay, so let's see. We'll continue.
But is clearly a kind of political failure, and that, of course, the plight of the Palestinians is a demonstration of that. Like, why can't Israel integrate the Palestinians? That is a mark of failure of Israel as a state. They don't get to that part. In other words, the punchline of my email was, this whole conflict is an example of that. And also, I would say, and this is something that I've been saying for a very long time, but it's also something taken up by other people on the left occasionally, which is, the world that we live in is the product of World War I and the aftermath of World War I and the failure of world socialist revolution after World War I. And Israel-Palestine, the Balfour Declaration, right, is a direct, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the imposition of these kind of neo-colonial protectorates by Britain and France as part of the Versailles Peace, as part of the Wilsonian League of Nations kind of project, but also not really a good example of the Wilsonian vision of the peace, right?
So here he's
So,
hydroplaning.
you know,
I would say he's throwing a lot of stuff on here, and again, it is a podcast forum, so we'll have, I'll try to give him that credit. But just to bring a big thing, the question like, well, why has the Israeli state failed to incorporate the Palestinians? Well, it's failed. What you alluded to earlier is that the Zionist project is for a Jewish nation state, and so in order to have a Jewish ethno state, you can't have lots of Palestinians or non-Jews at all.
Right.
So they would have to, like, the whole project of the Israeli nation state would have to be redone in order to incorporate Palestinians, who would then quite quickly, if not immediately, be the majority ethnic group in that state, which is something
Totally.
that. So I think that's and that was baked in the cake from the beginning. I mean,
Absolutely.
So
And I hope
think
we'll have time to talk. Hope we'll have time to talk about that Churchill Zionism versus Bolshevism article I showed you, because I think that makes very clear that, like, Zionism and Bolshevism were never compatible. Zionism and Marxism never really compatible. Although there was for a time a campaign to sort of make it seem that way to an international audience, that the founding Israelis were, in some ways socialists, but that's nonsense.
Yeah, and I think also my grasp on this topic from like the late 1990s on is much better than from before. So I want to.
Right. Well, I'm a big history nerd. That was my focus in school.
No, that's good. I'm just saying that's good because I know like the dates, and I know 1917. I know like Herschel. I know that some of the founding Zionists were actually atheists, and that was the thing that they wanted. They wanted Judaism to be like this kind of blood and this soil and blood thing rather than the religious source.
That's how they fooled people to thinking they were Marxists, I guess.
Maybe. Yeah, again, I'll have to defer to you on this because I only know like my dates there. And so I know 1917, I know Mandatory Palestine, I know Gurion, and then I know that there was some things going on before 1947, and then the Nakba, and on through that. But I think this is really kind of interesting. Like, well, this is a failure of the World War I, and then you have the Balfour Agreement, and it's like, well, it's like, okay, yeah, there was the Balfour Agreement. We could look at that, but it's like that these things aren't self-actualizing. Lots of things had to happen in order for them to get to a point in 1947 where they could declare the state of Israel, and and henceforth, from that, especially from that point in time. So I think it'd be really hard. I don't think it really says much of anything to attribute how we got to 1947 by saying, well, that was how World War II was resolved, and it's a failure of how that happened. And so that's why we have this. I think he's fast forwarding through a lot.
Yeah, it's kind of a banal statement. He's just kind of saying history exists.
Yeah.
And to the extent that he's making a valid statement, I guess he's saying that, like, it's not all the Jews' fault, because the British Empire is involved and the American Empire is involved. But that's true, but it is the Zionists' fault. It is the original Zionist founders' fault. As you said, they are responsible for this.
Yeah. I mean, the occupation, the apartheid, the stuff in there. I mean, it's. I mean, I think this is, if I remember correctly, this is what bothers me throughout. Is he seems to not want to focus on the asymmetry, like the pronounced asymmetry.
Right.
About what's going on there, and of course, and that would be fine, and of course, he's not going to get into the Nietzschean argument that, hey, it's too bad the Zionists got their shit together and were able to control territory and push people out. To the victor goes the spoils, and you should just. I mean, it's kind of like, I'm brushing over a lot. But yeah. So let's see. Before I get off track, I'm trying to. Sorry.
They never wanted they never wanted a multicultural democracy in Palestine. The Zionists never did.
No, and again, the cake that was never. it's a democracy for Jewish people, and then like even with that, I don't know if we'll have time if it makes sense to get into that now. But even with within Jewish people, there's a hierarchy. There's a racial hierarchy for sure, as far as, and maybe even a regional one. I'd imagine that there's certain. But okay, let me go back over this. Sorry, people, I'm just going to find the window I need. Getting lost in my window.
The peace after World War I that sets the world up for more war, actually, and not just World War II, but all the post-colonial wars. And Israel-Palestine is a clear example of that, right? Of, here's a kind of open, festering wound of history. And again, how we see that history. If we see it as, well, it's the racist settler, colonial state, and Zionist entity, I read somewhere. Someone dusted off this old 70s language of the Zionist entity. And I immediately flashed on the Symbionese Liberation Army, like, we will crush.
Okay, again, I think this is showing his, now I don't use, like, most people I know.
This is just bloody shirt nonsense.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. You can take off on this.
In the Middle East, among everybody who's not a Zionist, they never stop calling it the Zionist entity, right?
Yeah.
That's what they call it. They don't want to dignify it as
they don't want to acknowledge it as a state.
As a legitimate country. A lot of those countries don't recognize it diplomatically.
Yeah.
So they called it a Zionist entity and not a legitimate settled country. And the Symbionese Liberation Army, obviously not the only people who use that term. That's straw man and associating it with like I would say a genuine terrorist group.
Well, and did you see his body language? She's like, well, people want to like bring up the colonial thing, and then it's a settler colonial state. It is.
Exactly.
Now you could say like we have to deal with that, because I mean you're American, I'm also American, and it's like America's also a settler colonial state. But I don't know when the last meaningful Indian uprising or Indian battle was. I want to say it was probably 1900 or something. So probably about around 1900.
Wounded Knee generally is.
And what
although Wounded Knee wasn't even that was nonviolent.
Yeah. So from basically for the last 125, 135 years, that's basically been that was done. Not that it wasn't.
It's a fact on the ground, a very real. Yeah.
No, I'm not saying that people were happy about it or that the reservation and all this stuff. But in terms of the manifest destiny and all that, that's so, and it's one thing, and there's nobody alive now. There hasn't been people alive for a long time who were alive when that was still an active situation. Not that it means we can't do anything, acknowledge it or deal with the ramifications now. But this is ongoing in Israel. It's not done yet. We're in the final throes of it now. So to be like, I mean, I was really just I was like, dude, I mean, you can acknowledge all that and say, okay, yeah, but it's not, you can't see there not being a state of Israel. That this, at the end of the solution, if we finally get there, that it's not going to be that there's no Israel anymore. So some people do the one-state solution. There are people though who still, if you get out of your bubble, they still think that it's all likelihood that if the U.S. ever, if Israel loses the U.S.'s backing, then Israel is done. There's people who say that because they can't defend themselves because they're surrounded by people who they pissed off a lot. So. I mean, and I don't. It's hard for me to imagine there not being, I mean, to me, the thing that makes the most sense.
Except that they have nuclear weapons.
Yeah, well, that's true. That could be.
But I was going to say, I mean, there's a picture I've seen of a elderly Palestinian woman holding a sign at a demonstration saying, "I am older than your state." your quote unquote statement it says on her sign.
Yeah, there's a couple of people that I can't remember her name, but one of the Jewish Voices for Peace demonstration, I think in Grand Central Station, and I think she was 83, and she's like, I'm older than the state of Israel.
Right.
And you also see there's some women, there's some elderly people who look really quite elderly who are saying that they were that they fled their village during the Nakba in 1948, and now they're having to flee again. You know, so these really kind of really old looking. I'm sure they are old. It's not an easy life there. Right. But they're having to go. So the idea that this is somehow so in the past, I thought was really kind of. He's so dismissive of things that most people there and a lot of people around the world are far from dismissive of. So I found that you can try to be very risk board about it and say, okay, fine, but. If you look at the power board, you're gonna have to, it's not going anywhere. There's going to be some sort of state of Israel. Anyway, okay. Anything else you want to add before we carry on? We're only in 5 minutes, Garrett.
Say again.
We're only in 5 minutes.
to Catron? Well, okay.
Yeah. That's fine.
I have to go around 6, I think. But yeah, let's go.
Okay.
Let's go.
We still have time. Yeah, like an hour. Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
Let's see. Regale us.
The fascist insects. The Zionist entity, the fascist insects, like all this kind of post-New Left madness of the 70s. We seem to be there, Doug. But in a way, we've always been there on the issue of Israel-Palestine, haven't we? At least since '67.
Okay, and I would also point out that may very well be the case. But look at how the Zionists and especially the Zionists in Israel. Look at how they talk about Palestinians.
Totally.
And that's not new either. That's been pretty consistent. I mean, it's uptick now, of course, because you have, they're trying to, rationalize and keep up the emotion for what's going on in Gaza and the West Bank. But he doesn't mention that at all.
No. I mean, it's obvious that Zionist entity is not the same thing as fascist insect.
No.
Hamas. Zionist entity is something that some of the more sort of moderate and professional elements in the Middle East use. The Qataris probably use that, and the Iranians. Hamas may say nastier things, but as you said, the Israelis also say dehumanizing things about the Palestinians.
Right. I mean, my God, yeah. And again, you have the situation. I mean, So that's interesting. So let's see. Is he Mossad? No. That's the thing now that I've noticed in some circles. Everybody's
he should be getting paid for this.
I don't know if you have this in your circles, but at least not in my real life, but online. I've been checking out some of those X spaces, those Twitter spaces, and it's like, oh, so and so's PSYOP, so and so's a CIA plant, and this and this and that. And I'm just like, all right, it's obvious. I'm aware that the CIA has, assets and likes to cultivate things and support certain things and not others. So I meant that as a joke. I'm not seriously making the argument that Chris Patron is a CIA plant, even though he's just talking like one of it, or how I imagine one might talk. I got to stay out of those spaces.
I have no direct evidence one way or the other. Let me put it that way.
We cannot confirm or deny the status of the relationship, formal or just their interests just happen to align between.
But as I think you and I were talking about, they're in denial about the Frankfurt School and a lot of other lefty academics getting CIA money, and so I find their denial about that kind of suspicious.
Yeah, and also the fact that just because they were funded doesn't mean they were like in cahoots. I mean, it could just be that they were
not consciously, but
yeah.
maybe it means that
my,
they were
understanding is
elevated.
that they were like, okay, we're fine with this theory. This theory doesn't upset our plans at all. So let's keep this up. This is the great kind of left for us.
But you start to wonder if certain people are sort of elevated to prominence, and get to have nice big conferences and nice video graphics because certain people like them.
Yeah, that's not that. Then maybe Chris Catrone isn't, or he's bad at it because he's not. I think he's an adjunct lecturer, and he has the control zone. Yeah, and he has some nice memorabilia, some maybe out of fresh mint condition. What do you call them? Action figures. So I don't know. Anyway, I shouldn't be mean. Okay.
At least since the annexation of the occupied territories, or whatever you want to call it, the acquisition of the occupied territories. I guess they were never annexed exactly. But the Israeli victory in '67 has set the stage, right? And so it is this kind of very overwrought issue that's difficult to reconnect to the issue of capitalism, right? On the face of it, it seems like to bring up capitalism and the struggle for socialism is to somehow avoid the issue, is to somehow dodge the issue entirely. Because what about the suffering of the Palestinians? Right. And, but you could say that about everything. You could say that about police brutality in the United States. Pretty much anything and everything is a huge leap to the question of capitalism and the struggle for socialism.
With the rare exception in 2008 of the economic or financial crisis.
But again, how the economic crisis played out politically,
No, what I would just want to say is that, if you look at U.S. foreign policy and why the U.S. is so interested in Israel, obviously there's a lot of people in Israel who have who are also, there's a lot of dual citizenship, so American Israeli peeps. But it's quite clear. They say it's the unsinkable aircraft carrier. They're very interested in the Middle East because of the oil and natural gas, and so it behooves them to have Israel there. And this whole thing. So it's kind of the U.S. makes friends with all kinds of nefarious regimes and questionable characters. So it's okay, Israel's important to us. There's the settlements, there's the occupation and all that, but we need to have the state of Israel there. And we can say it's because, for whatever reason, because the Jews need a homeland and whatnot, which, that's another issue. But the idea that you can't connect this to capitalism and the U.S.'s interest in that region and how that would allow them to turn a blind eye, or to not, that somehow what Israel does vis-a-vis the Palestinians is just a side issue. I don't think that's that difficult an argument to make.
No, it's not. And he's following up when he called it a failure of the 20th century. He's sort of suggesting that this stuff is by mistake and not by imperial scheming, right?
Yeah.
The Israel being there in a state of perpetual war, from the perspective of the British Empire and the American Empire, that is not a failure, that's a success, right? So he's expanding on his original faulty framing of this.
Yeah. Okay, let's see if we can continue on. Let's see.
Political realm, how did it play out? So with Black Lives Matter, it's the loss of public assets.
Anti-austerity movements first, right? And then calls to nationalize the banks and to return to the New Deal and Fordism and Keynesianism. But let's not talk about that. What I want to point out is, to me, and you tell me if this is wrong. To me, it seems like I am asked to consider two things in this moment, which are not disconnected but aren't directly connected, or are not the same thing. One is, what is wrong with the American left? It's the question I'm always asking, but I'm asking it anew. And two people yesterday came to me, friends of mine, people who I've worked with on this kind of project in the past, and I won't say their names, came to me and said, "Listen, I'm done with the left. I'm leaving the left.
I think I've heard from the same people.
Yeah. Right.
And I feel like I've always felt this way about the left's response to this issue. I've always felt, I think the way I put it is, we think we're talking about one thing, capitalism and socialism and Marxism and a left. And then you realize in the face of this kind of a phenomenon that actually people are talking about something entirely different, right? In other words, they're not interested in what we're interested in. And of course, that's the basic point of the left being dead.
The question still remains, like, how is it possible that so quickly people who are calling themselves socialists embraced Hamas in this moment, and how uncritically people seem to embrace Hamas and insist
This is incredibly disingenuous.
Not the protection of the Palestinian.
Okay, so this again, because I only have my real life and my virtual life. I've never, ever. The only time I've come across people who completely embrace Hamas, both like ideologically and politically, and in terms of their idea that the only way we're going to ever be free is through armed resistance, is through kind of an eye for an eye type of thing. The only people I would be like when I was in Gaza and I was I taught for Tears of the American International School in Gaza during 2002 and 2004 during the Second Intifada. So you get invited. Obviously, you get invited to your students' house all the time. Once you go to one, you have to go to all, or it's a big brouhaha. So I was constantly having, which is great because they fed me well. So of course, at some time, especially more in the refugee camp areas, students, their families were Hamas members or Hamas supporters. So yeah, but outside of that, or maybe Hezbollah or other people who outside, I can't think of anybody in the U.S. left who is so who would fully embrace the necessity of armed resistance and all that entails, because most people just can't. They can only go nonviolent. They can't make the leap. So I don't know who he's talking about or who they're talking about.
Well, here is the thing I recently realized, and I don't know if you realize this. Norman Finkelstein is friendly with Cutrone, and Sublation published his last book.
Yeah.
But Finkelstein has recently said, he said on Twitter, he was looking for a new publisher, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
And he participated in a platypus conference, I think less than a year ago. So, but anyway, first of all, there's that relationship, which is Norman Finkelstein, who does, from their perspective, apologize for Hamas and considers them to be a legitimate resistance organization, and Finkelstein is a Marxist. He's at the forefront of that. So what are they talking about? They don't know about this association, and they haven't, heard an articulate Marxist argument about it. Like that's incredibly disingenuous. It's just ridiculous. And then Finkelstein would say that this is. The lies of the Zionists are so monumental. It's not just a matter of taking sides. It's just a matter of telling the truth to people in the West who are deceived. It's a matter of history not being falsified by imperialists. Like that, just that very basic thing, even without getting into the morality of it. And Finkelstein is a real scholar who's gone toe to toe with other Zionist scholars like Dershowitz, and other than Harvard or and whoever putting their finger on the scale, I think has pretty much conclusively proven that Dershowitz is a liar and is a fraud of a scholar, and Finkelstein, history is pretty important to everybody, but it's particularly important to Marxists. So
Yeah. No, what I would
It's
think
just
is
a
that,
ridiculous
I
argument.
think that Norman Finkelstein, I also, it's like, I don't condemn or condone Hamas because I'm not Palestinian and I'm not there. But I know enough to know that it's bullshit this is the word, this is the how insidious the word terrorist and terror is. Because it's so connected to Hamas, terrorist Hamas, that everything else goes away. It's like they have been from the start a resistance movement, a armed resistance movement, a violent resistance movement, steeped in what I guess people would call. I'd have to someone who's a Muslim would have to tell me how radical their interpretation of the Quran is. I'm sure I'm sure they focus on the interpretation that bolsters their movement. I'm not an Islamic scholar, so I can't know. So is Hamas a Marxist-Leninist resistance movement? No. Is it an Islamic resistance movement? Yes. Is it a resistance movement? Yes. An armed resistance movement.
Yes, and they started out as a
And now
relatively.
I want to be very careful in case anybody's on here. Now, when they decided to take up their suicide bombing campaign, was that terrorism? Yes, that was terrorism. Does that mean they're not an armed resistance group? No, they're an armed resistance group that took a terror route in the Second Intifada. They rolled that dice. They thought if they scared enough Israelis to make the Israelis realize that we're just not going to hang out here forever. This is going to affect you too. And you could say, pardon the pun, that backfired because it didn't work out that way. So yeah, it's a suicide bombing, a terrorist act. Yeah, but so is this brutal regime. Is also the Palestinians have been terrorized.
So is bombing hospitals. So is
bombing hospitals. So is carpet bombing. So is starving. So
is what Israel did in 1948.
And so, yeah,
the U.S. State Department told what Israel in 1948. Some of their militias, the Irgun, they called it Zionist terrorism. So Hamas did not introduce terror tactics to the Mideast.
No. And they didn't start the violence, so they didn't start the fire.
No. They're 40 years late to that party.
Yeah. So this thing, and I don't know, maybe in Portland and in Chicago, there's people who are hardcore Hamas, and maybe because I always laugh when I can't remember the guy's name, McGregor or something. He's on Tucker Carlson sometimes. This guy who's like saying there's Hamas in Mexico or something. So the idea that Hamas isn't just in Gaza, but it's like some sort of global, because they want to make it. And I'm like, really? Because
Hamas is ISIS.
Yeah, well, yeah. So I'm like, Hamas, as far as
everybody knows.
It's like their goals are very focused. They're an armed resistance movement and they're a nationalist movement. What are they fighting for? They're fighting for a Palestinian state. And they
as far as I know, Hamas have never called for reviving the caliphate. As far as I know, they haven't beheaded anybody. Those are the Saudis.
No. So this whole thing is just, and when I'm glad I wasn't listening, because when I was listening to this, I'm like, what's going on in Portland?
Right.
I'm like, okay. I mean, I've seen Palestinian flags. I've seen people say, ceasefire now, and Palestine will be free. I've seen all this. But if there's some sort of, if there's Hamas splinter groups inside leftist organizations, which ones? The DSA? Are you kidding me?
Yeah, well, the DSA aren't even on a national level pro-Palestinian.
But Antifa's busy beating up women who say that men aren't women. So they're pretty busy right now. I don't know if they can also pick up
Antifa, they actually have some crypto-Zionist tendencies. Honestly, in Germany, they're so guilty. I mean, Antifa is so closely aligned with white guilt. In Germany, it's like German guilt to the point where they are openly Zionist. So it's not definitely not a natural ally with Hamas.
Isn't that kind of ironic that Zionism is some sort of crypto outlet for Nazi I don't know, it's to keep with the sublation media that that this kind of sublated Nazi Zionism, whatever, that it's okay to express these sentiments and actions if you do it for Zionism and for the state of Israel, but not for the Aryan right or whatever it was. Germany. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean they're totally
I'm
whitewashing.
in my armchair Freud now, but yeah. Okay. So let's see what else he's going to. I'm really. I mean, who knew that? Who knew that Portland was such a hotbed of Hamas? Did not know that. Okay.
And not a rejection of the Israeli response, not a call for some alternative to massive bombing campaigns in Gaza. Nothing like those were not the talking points. The talking points were go Hamas, basically, for the first day from my little tiny milieu.
Okay, so his people.
Most people. So that's the first thing. The question I have to ask is why is an embrace of Hamas becoming
obligatory?
Tribal, obligatory.
Well, it goes back a way, right? So I feel like in the entire period of Platypus, right? So there are a couple of things that I want to say. So one is, you brought this up with Fakhri, but and it came up with Helen Rollins as well, with the Northern Ireland example, which is the post-Cold War settlement of issues that were not, due to the Cold War, but certainly fed by the Cold War. So apartheid, South Africa, Northern Ireland, and Israel-Palestine. Because these were conflicts that were actually proxy conflicts in the Cold War. Right? So the IRA, the provisional IRA, they were not communists necessarily, right? But they, were funded, trained, supplied by the East, by the Warsaw Pact. They were fostered, right? The East did foster terrorism. They did. Like the Soviet bloc did foster terrorism. And, so...
As did the West as well. Right.
Okay, so maybe this, I'm such a leftist that, of course, it goes without saying.
I know, but I just want to...
West
I just
supports fascists and everything else, right?
You just have to, right now, I feel like we have to say that. Otherwise, we're going to come off to some people like we're defending the West or something. But
oh my God.
No, right. So, okay, so I guess that brings...
Jesus Christ. This is what I think is so hilarious. It's like, no, we're not defending the West, but we're just defending... It's always easy to be critical of somebody else, but so first he's saying, of course the West supports fascists, of course it's terroristic, but like a little while ago it was it was about the fascist insect, and so it's very odd what's going on here, but we'll see. Do you have anything to say, or should I push play again?
I just to agree with you what you said, and and there's
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Sorry, I should let it go a bit more, but it's just.
Up the other thing that is circulating around, which is, Hamas was not started by Israel, but it was supported by Israel against the PLO, right?
That's that right.
So, and again, the PLO would have been the Soviet bloc client.
So I don't want to disrupt the where you were going, because in the conversation with Helen Rollins about Northern Ireland, my point was that my understanding was that the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War allowed for some internal investment, including in Ireland and Northern Ireland, which might have helped along the creating conditions that could help bring a peaceful.
Well, look. The Palestinians have been funded by the international community, by the EU, by the United States, by the UN. They have.
Right.
It's
but
not,
through aid. But through aid, like subsistence funding.
Well, that's what Helen was saying about Northern Ireland, that it is subsidized in a way that no other part of the United Kingdom is.
Right, but there's different kinds of subsidies. There's subsidies where you bring in food and basics to people, and that is more
general financial subsidies. Right.
Yeah, but this was a kind of subsidies that helped develop tech production and. Well,
right. So it's okay. So let's back it up a bit. So I don't want to make it into just economics, right? So
I'm not trying to say that either. But this gets it back to the Cold War, because I said the dividend you know, the peace dividend after the Cold
They
War
didn't
had an
talk
impact.
ahead of
But then
time.
the other side of that would be the politics.
He doesn't want to talk about morality, and he doesn't want to talk about economics.
Oh,
What does he want to talk
right.
about?
And so the
Yeah.
thing is, if you look at Hamas, and when is Hamas's real opportunity? It's in the failure of the peace process, right? And so it's the failure of Oslo and Oslo II, and it's also, you know, the first and second intifadas, right? And so really, though, it's a kind of a late phenomenon, Hamas, and Hamas coming to power in Gaza. And so it's really bound up, you know, fundamentally with, we could say, the failure of Arab nationalism. It's bound up with the failure. I mean, really, Islamism generally in the Middle East is a phenomenon of the failure of Arab nationalism. That's why it flourishes really starting in the 70s. You know, and that's why you have the Iranian Revolution. Because there's a crisis of the developmental state, and the political regime of the developmental state in the Arab world is nationalism.
Okay, well, we have lots of things. First of all, there's never been a developmental state in Gaza because there's no Palestinian state, so that's one thing.
Right.
I mean, yeah. I think Hamas in 1987. I think was in the middle of the entity called Hamas took shape in the refugee camp areas of Gaza. I think there was a cleric and also I think it was a medical doctor. Anyway, and yeah, but when they really came on the scene was during the second intifada, because they bumped up and decided I'm fast forwarding a lot because, and again, for anybody watching, I'm going to have, I don't know if it's going to be this weekend or next weekend, we're going to do an episode where we focus on Tariq's book called Hamas Contained, The Rise and Fall of Palestinian Liberation. And this is a book that actually is based on, Tariq spent a couple of years total, I think, in Gaza, also mainly in Gaza, but also in Israel and the West Bank. So it's based actually on talking to people and the archives, and actually talking to Hamas officials and the fighters and all of that. And so I'm looking forward to. I'm not fully reading that, but we're going to bring that in to have an episode that's fully on Hamas, the history of that up from 1987 into the present. Anyway, but the thing is, they saw what was happening is that when the PLO, the first thing the PLO the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the first thing they had to do was to accept the state of Israel, of course, fine, and then they had to agree to nonviolence, not to create a peaceful means. And Hamas is watching this, the leadership at the time, and saying this is a road to nowhere. This is just going to kill us off slowly. They were the mind that the only way that the resistance is going to have to be an armed resistance, or else it was just going to be bit by bit, or they would end up with a state that was really no state, just kind of cantonments or something. Now, whether or not that's true or not, but if you look at that from now, it seems like
the settlements under Israeli arms would expand endlessly.
Yeah. And the PLO is being
under Israeli arms, paid for by the United States.
Yeah,
would expand endlessly.
Mm-hmm.
With the PLO capitulating to Oslo.
Yeah. So that was my understanding of why they not only that they formed, but that they grew. Yeah. So it's one thing if you have a handful of people that feel this way, but their base of support grew. Particularly, Fatah was more of a rich man and woman's game, relatively speaking, and Hamas's base of support was mainly in the refugee camps. So the poor, the 60% of the population that is, in relative to absolute poverty. We'll get into more of that later. But this idea that they were, because what he's making them sound to be is like these really nefarious opportunists. Is what they are. And now there could very well be political, economic opportunism. I'm not, I don't want to sing their praises. I want to try to deal as much as possible with the facts that we have and the historical record. But the idea that's the thing that I got like this, like, they benefited from the peace process. So yeah, it's been fantastic for them. I mean, maybe the guys in Qatar are having a pretty good time, but people in Gaza are not thinking this is really working out all to plan. But
Right.
Anyway,
well, if you're not a moralist, how could you blame them for being opportunists, right? And if you're a critical-minded Marxist, then you should be criticizing the PLO for failing, right? You should be offering them constructive criticism, not if you're not being a moralist and you're not taking sides, But he's being selectively moralist. Like when it comes to judging the Israelis, he won't be moral. But when he judges Hamas, he's a bit more moral.
And this is something from the last election that Israel and America allowed to happen, the infamous election of 2006, that saw Hamas got 132. There's 132 total seats in the I think they call it the Palestinian political, I don't know, Palestinian legislature or whatever. They have some sort of name that sounds like a state, but it's not a state. But you can see here that after the 2006 election, that 74 of the 132 seats were won by Hamas. And most of those were in Gaza, but not all of those were in Gaza, but most of them were, the majority of them. And here you see that there's the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that's technically a Marxist, the Popular Front and the Democratic Front are apparently, if you go to their website, there's apparently steeped in Leninist Marxism, and you can see how popular they are. They have 3 seats, or they won 3 seats in the last election. So whatever, I don't know what's going on. It could be leadership or it could also be the fact that.
But they're not enemies of Hamas. It should be pointed out. Because there's because Hamas are so popular, you can't really afford to be enemies with them. But I mean, but again, Hamas are not enemies with them. They're not trying to stamp them out of existence. And in the present fight, they are in coalition, and that's something Coutron should know. But he's pretending he doesn't, so he's either a fool or a liar on that point. He should know that the Marxist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, led by the very famous, Layla Khalid, is in coalition with Hamas right now as far as the present fight. The Al-Quds brigades.
Okay.
So they're not. So Hamas are not anti-Marxist. They are not really totalitarian on that level. They recognize other political parties.
And also, fun fact, Sharia law has not been introduced or officially, it's not Sharia law in Gaza. Are they very conservative? Yeah. Is it a conservative? Yeah. But it's not Sharia law it's not the official law of the Gaza. It's not Sharia law. And there's certain things, again, because Hamas needs not necessarily everybody that lives in Gaza to be happy with them, but they can't. If too many people get upset with them, then there's no more Hamas politically.
Basically, yeah.
So and again, that's why you also there's a lot of informants in Israel. You have the enemy of my enemy. There was fighting that broke out after 2006 between the Fatah officials. I don't know how, I wasn't there, so I don't know accurate reports like how bloody that was. But yeah, there was people who they felt had sold them out, and some of them did. I mean, there's people get perks, Mahmoud Abbas, and there are people who get basically just figureheads, but they basically are, they basically work for Tel Aviv. So that's not untrue. Right. That's not untrue. So the idea that so like anything else, any group you have that has any size to it, there's going to be the politics between the groups and the politics within the group. That doesn't have any. But again, he is trying to deal with things at a larger, maybe a really large, macro or I don't know, Coutron level. Okay, let's continue.
Yeah, and let me just say that they were around they do seem to have been around organically before Israel started like covertly funding them. But they were more nonviolent then during the first Intifada, which was almost completely nonviolent. So like they appear to have gotten more violent the more Israel has funded them. You know, they may have been filling them with agent provocateurs. But there also is an organic and non-terroristic side to Hamas, which we have seen in recent years because Hamas were involved in the March of Return, which was a largely non-violent.
They became also a governing party, yeah. So you can't just govern if all you have are the armed fighting brigades. There's also for lack of a better word, the municipal side, the governing side.
Right.
You have the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, and people trying to keep the lights on.
Programs, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and then you have, of course, the political strategic people, and then you have the guys who run the militias, or what they call the Al-Aqsam brigades, I always forget the word. So I always want to call it the name of the mosque, but I don't think that's it. Al-Assam. Anyway. And then you have just the rank and file, you have receptionists and people who clean the building. And also, this is the thing is that I want to talk a bit about this more when I review Treek's book, Hamas Contained, but also that it's not unheard of that organizations evolve and change. Sometimes either they're defeated and they die, the organization, or they attain the goal and they dissolve, or they attain the goal and they become something else.
Right.
So it's not like the party that was organized, so I'll use Mahatma Gandhi and the National Congress Party like that. It's not like when the British finally got out that all of a sudden like, okay, well, we're done now. They switched over to wanting to run for office and for the newly independent India. So I mean, they weren't obviously nonviolent was a thing there, but it's not unheard of that an armed resistance movement or a movement or a group that at one point was on the outside of the status quo becomes a part of it. I mean, this happens all the time historically.
Well, as Ben Shapiro's friend Jordan Peterson likes to say, bad times bring hard men.
There you go.
Okay?
Yes.
What?
But yeah.
The times have been very bad in Gaza, which tends to harden people.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I also think it's funny how the people who are all for the Second Amendment and the need to have a well-armed militia to fight off state tyranny, apparently that's only for people in the States. Other people can't have armed militias to fight off tyranny.
Yeah.
It's like, don't you know? It's like Israel can tread all over Palestinians, but that's okay. Don't tread on me doesn't extend there. But okay. Let's see what else we have here, because I know you can't stay forever. So let's see. I was hoping let's see if he's going to get to the beheaded babies and the child soldiers on meth. That was a highlight. Okay. Oops, I'm on the wrong screen.
So the failure of that nationalism then gives rise to Islamism politically.
Just to be clear, what's the developmental state is what particularly as opposed to other kinds of states?
You should know this by now.
Post-colonial state, the idea of building up a national economy, building up national autonomy at an economic level. So seemingly the opposite of globalization.
Right. So not if there's foreign investment, it's not investment for private entities in the
States. There were, but there's a large public nationalized
Doug.
Right.
And so, you could say that the last Arab nationalist states in classic form, although of course quite still affected by the history we're discussing, the neoliberal era, would be the Ba'athist Iraq and Ba'athist Syria, right? Egypt had gone through a change, in the neoliberal era. I mean, it had been, a kind of a center, Nasserism had been kind of prototypical for Arab nationalism. And, Gaddafi's Libya was also some kind of a holdout. right? But there is this idea that like the West is knocking out all the, Arab nationalists.
But this was before neoliberalism fully took hold, though. You're saying that the developmental states in the Middle East were in crisis.
We're in crisis.
And what caused those developmental states?
Oh, the global downturn. The global downturn affects, so when we think about things like,
okay, this is fine, but it's also the fact that, again, I find it interesting that obviously the global downturn in the 70s affected states in the Middle East. But the fact is that you had all these client regimes. You had the client regimes my understanding is that they would be supported by the United States, and so then they would clamp down and make sure that they would make sure their population didn't get in the way of U.S. foreign policy. And in exchange for that, a lot of these dictators would get like weapons, and they'd be allowed to basically do what they wanted within their own borders. So there was that, but also the states that did try to develop there seems to be like with Iran, and also Afghanistan before the Afghan war with Russia. They were on a fairly solid developmental track. They were basically ousted because they wanted too much autonomy. Especially in Iran with what happened there. So I don't know. I'm not certain. The idea that somehow, again, it seems like when it suits him, he'll focus only on the economic. So now, in terms of and what this has to do with Israel with Palestine, I don't know, because that was never. It was occupied this whole time. So I'm not sure what that has to do with that, unless he's going to tie in together. Yeah. So it seems to be a bit all over the place, but I find it confusing and interesting that now he's like only on the economics. There was an economic downturn. And so then the kind of new or young developmental states in Ba'athist Iraq and Syria is talking about had a really hard time because of that. Okay, that could very well be true. But there was also a tremendous amount of interference.
Right. He keeps using the word failure as if like he could have done a better job. Which I guess would be fair. Would be fair at least if he at least tried to explain it. And acknowledges again, as you said, why they failed. The fact that they were constantly under attack, and it's kind of like
it could very well be that there was
implying they failed because they were dictatorships. He's implying that, but it's like, well, they were dictatorships because democracies like Mossadeq's were vulnerable to CIA subversion and color revolutions, so can he explain how to get around that? Otherwise, it's just like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, which is not a constructive criticism.
No. All right, so let's see.
The Great Recession or like the global downturn, we do think of the metropolitan world. But what you have to understand is that as hard as it hits the metropolitan world, it hits the rest of the world a lot harder. Right? And so the Shah of Iran was brought down basically by the collapse of the world economy in the 70s. Right? And so, we forget these things. And the left historically had subordinated itself in the Stalinist era, had turned itself into a tale of Arab nationalism and had discredited itself accordingly. Right? So the decline of Arab nationalism also, involved the decline of the socialist communist left, so to speak, although Arab nationalism also played a role in actively suppressing and wiping out the socialist and communist left in the Middle East. And I don't want to give too much credence to that because they were Stalinist parties, and so they were kind of not exactly what we would be interested in, really. But generally they agreed with a kind of third world nationalism in a way that, of course,
so did the United States at that time.
Oh, absolutely. Right. So of course the United States has a national developmental. So here's a little known fact: the Kennedy administration supported Algerian nationalism against the French. right? Despite the Cold War, right? And so, again, maybe a dicey move, maybe, but not really. Algeria pretty solidly in the Western camp.
Which is why someone like Peter Dale Scott, this pretty smart conspiracy theorist, once told me years ago, like over a decade ago, that the student worker strikes of May in 1968 were a CIA plot.
Oh, wow. Right.
Yeah, right.
Well, they might
because the
well
U.S. interests, because the U.S. interests and French Gaullist interests were not the same.
They're not the same.
Right.
They're still not the same.
Right.
Right? The EU and, the United States don't have the same interests. I mean, they, of course, from our perspective, they have the same interests. But in terms of capitalism, there's a lot of room. So let's reframe things. So that's where Hamas comes from. Right? And, so the current conflict, right? Because I feel like every few years there's a blow up of Israel-Palestine. There's some kind of military conflict. So the issue, I think, analytically, if you will, is
one
why
side
the
has
present
military
conflict
and
is
one that doesn't. But details.
So say again.
I also watched.
Sorry.
So you also interviewed Daniel Ben-Ami.
Sorry.
And
military conflict. I just wanted to mention that it's important, and again, most people are going to know this, but he neglects again this idea. Well, this military conflict. Okay, one side has the super military backed by the superist military, and one side doesn't have a military. They have some armed fighters. They have guns and like hand grenades and homemade rockets against everything.
I just also like to point out. I like to point out, like, I'm not exactly an expert on this, but the economic downturn in the 1970s was partly, maybe largely, because the Arab oil-producing states went on strike and had the oil embargo against Israel and against the West. And it's odd not to mention that. Now, you could say maybe they shot themselves in the foot because by attacking the West, they overturned the whole global economy. I don't know. But it's weird not to mention that. You could criticize them for it. You could do whatever, but it's not as if they're passive actors in the economic downturn of the 1970s.
Well, and also the idea that what I don't understand is that how does he's making the thing that the failure that Hamas is a creature of the failure of Arab nationalism. That statement doesn't stand on its own. I mean, I guess you can make the argument, but it's like, so you could like try to have a mental experiment. So let's say that there was more success. There was some successful Arab nationalist movements, or they ended up being, because and I'm also saying, like, in terms of the failure of that, because there are states, there are nations. There's Iran, there's Iraq, there's Syria, there's Saudi Arabia.
Well, you would consider Iran Islamist, but they're not really.
Okay, so but Middle East, like, so he's like about the nationalist projects. So if they fail, then he's saying that they failed, then what was in their replacement? Because he doesn't really say what he's going to call these regimes. Because just you can have a nationalist, if you have a nationalist project, it could be a democracy, it could be a dictatorship, it could be authoritarian, it could be all kinds of things. Nationalism doesn't tell us very much of anything about the political structure of a country, besides that there's a nationalist project. So I'm trying to figure out. Anyway, I mean, again, it's a podcast, so there's a limited thing, but the idea that somehow you can draw a straight line from the failure of what he's calling Arab nationalism to Hamas is odd to me. Rather than Hamas what created Hamas was the Israeli occupation. That's what at the beginning created Hamas. And you can go in terms of like what allows for the Israeli occupation, the various factors in there, and why a lot of Arab countries, they say things that don't really do much about it, or when they did, they got defeated. I mean, you can make that argument. the idea that Hamas is only here because of a failure of Arab nationalism seems very spurious to me. I mean, he would have to put more meat on those bones, I think.
Yeah, there's nothing meaningful being said here other than Arabs are losers, which is like, yeah, okay, I guess so, but why are they losers? How could they not be losers? What could be different? If they're losing, that means Israel and the West is winning in the region. How did that come to be? And look at that from their perspective. It's not a failure. It's a success. You know. You know, not meaningful.
Okay. So it's not just me. That's all right. Okay. So I might have to write a little Substack based on our powwow here. Okay, here we go.
He was resistant to a geopolitical analysis a little bit, and that is like a very foregrounded kind of thing now in the mainstream media. You know, people are like, well, Hamas attacked because it's a proxy of Iran, and they're trying to prevent the Saudi-Israeli rapprochement, right? The expansion of the Abraham Accords. Yes, that's a factor. Right, like we should not forget that the Saudi-Iranian conflict is much greater than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Actually, like Iran wants nuclear weapons. Saudi Arabia wants nuclear weapons. Why? For each other.
Because of Israel. No, for each other. Right.
Not for Israel. No. No, this is the thing. Iran does not want nuclear weapons because of Israel. Iran wants nuclear weapons because of Saudi Arabia. That's the actual reason.
And here's another interesting thing, is that we're just supposed to take his word for all of that. That might very well be, but like, what is he basing this on? I mean, he's in Chicago. He reads a lot of theory and teaches at an art school, teaches social theory at an art school. So how is he an expert and knows why Hamas and Iran and Saudi Arabia do what they do?
Yeah, there's no reason to believe him. I could believe that Iran wants nukes because of both Israel and Saudi Arabia, but I don't believe that Israel is relevant to that. Sorry.
The United States. I mean, one thing that the United States has shown everybody is that if you want the United States to leave you alone, you should get a nuclear weapon.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, that's like, you know. And of course,
does North Korea want nuclear weapons because of Saudi Arabia too? Or because of South Korea? Well, South Korea is relevant because the U.S. is backing them, much like the U.S. is backing Saudi Arabia. Can I suggest, by the way, that you put the speed up, maybe like 1.25 on that?
Yeah, that's a good idea because it's slow. And also, let's see, we'll take about 5 more minutes, and then we'll have to. That's a good idea because I was also thinking it seemed, although it does seem slower when you're doing it this way. When you're just like hanging out listening. Let's see, settings, playback speeds, 125. Here we go.
And Saudi Arabia was asking to receive nuclear weapons in exchange for the deal with Israel. And
nuclear technology, peaceful nuclear technology. Not nuclear weapons, peaceful nuclear technology. But, you know, people talk about the Iranian nukes have to be stopped, otherwise there'll be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. They don't mean between Israel and Iran. They mean between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Right? And so that's really, you know, because the Yemen war has all been about Saudi versus Iran, right? Also, the Syrian civil war is Saudi versus Iran. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
He's just symbolic about all things Middle East.
Geopolitically, hardly important at all, actually. And that's the tragedy of the Palestinians. No one cares. No one cares. Right? It's not like
you don't care.
The American left does, and by the way, the U.S. government does too. Meaning the U.S. government does not want to see the expulsion of the Palestinians. Right? Another like little known fact: the U.S. government is not like Zionist in this way, right? No, and it goes back to I was reminded that George Herbert Walker Bush, again, right? So he's kind of bridging the post-Cold War era. He made aid.
Okay, well, sadly, we might not get to when he talks about the child Hamas soldiers on Mount.
Aren't Marxists supposed to be materialists and, you know, looking at the material relations? He's going to go on and say that George Bush, criticized the settlements. Yeah, but did he stop funding? Did he stop funding them?
No. Well, no, and also people would say, "Oh, that's why he was only a one-term president because the AIPAC has," and that's another thing. And of course, AIPAC has a lot of power, but this idea to be that American isn't there's no Zionist Americans. Is he out of his mind? I mean, they're making plans.
Biden literally said he was a Zionist. Biden literally said that, and again, more important than the rhetoric is $30 billion over the past 10 years.
And also that Zionism is geopolitical. At its core, it's geopolitical. So what is this guy? I mean, and not all of them. Like some of them are for it because of the Christian Zionists and all that kind of stuff. That the Jews have to be in charge of Israel so that Jesus could come again and then I guess smite them. I don't know. But this idea that it's very geopolitical, they know this. They understand that they're also the quote unquote unsinkable aircraft carrier. That's all about that. It wouldn't be the case if it wasn't for the region that they're in. And this idea, it's like and this is before he had that, but the things have been linked, since then, is that they're making plans for them for how they're going to support the refugees when they finally end up in the Sinai or wherever. That's been U.S. That's been linked on that, or like part of the policy. Also, you see what's coming out of Israel, and the idea that they could give I mean, I know this was only like a week afterwards, but somehow the idea that the U.S. cares. I would say do they really care about the U.S. government foreign policy-wise care about the Palestinians? No, I mean they'll let the Israelis get away with what they can get away with. But right now they seem quite fine with keep on lying to us about what we see until maybe half, if not more, of Gaza is cleared out, and not to go back. They're like that's part of the funding for this. So I don't know what he's talking about, but it's he's again just talking out of his ass. I don't know where he gets his information, but he puts it in this story that it sounds, if you don't know better, it sounds quite like, okay, yeah, fine. Yeah, okay. But the idea that there's the Zionism is totally what, a Tel Aviv thing? An Israeli thing? Is he crazy? Oh my God!
I mean, they're denouncing conspiracy theorists, but it's like their premise is basically a conspiracy theory that like everything you see is not what it seems. Everything you know is wrong. They're lying about being Zionists. They're lying about giving. It's just ridiculous.
I mean, Zionism crazy? It's a geopolitical project. It's the state of Israel or Greater Israel. Basically, they're talking about now also part of Syria, part of Lebanon. Part of take it all, whatever. And you think that the United States wouldn't be a-okay with that if they can get away with it? They would totally be fine with it. They'd be so fine with it. But they also have to, And so this idea
if they can get away with it,
And it's not because it's only some of them are also Christians and they think what else, but it's also because it's geopolitically, strategically so important for them. As long as Middle East oil and gas is important to them, so I don't know what he's talking about here. Very bizarre. George W. Bush. Anyway, we only have about 14 minutes, so I guess we'll just play a couple more minutes and then we'll just wrap up since you have to go soon.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I should have thought about that. I totally forgot that you could fast forward it because it was, dragging on. Let's see what else we have here.
To Israel contingent on halting the settlements. And that is the U.S. policy, by the way. In other words, the U.S. does, like the rest of the world, consider the settlements to be illegal. And no U.S. money can go to the settlements.
Oh, so they don't?
Right? Nominally, it can't. Yeah,
nominally.
Right? So they're against the settlements, right? And of course, the U.S., any peace deal, land for peace, right? What does land for peace mean? It means Israel giving up the settlements.
And that was 20 years ago.
Right. So, like the U.S. position, I mean, because this is the other thing about the left, and we get lost in the rhetoric, I think, and the negotiating positions, right? I was just reading with the Platypus kids, Hegel's Introduction to the Philosophy of History. And he starts off with a discussion of writers, historians of the past, but really chroniclers, original history, and Julius Caesar. And he's like, military transactions. That's the phrase he uses, military transactions. So what we're seeing is a military transaction, meaning this is negotiating with bombs and bullets and slit throats, and this is ultimately a negotiation. That's what it is. So the idea that, history will judge Hamas correct because in the future the Palestinians will be free, and then this will be seen as a heroic uprising like the Warsaw Ghetto or the Nat Turner Rebellion. No, that's not going to be the future. Like, the future is not going to look back and say, that this was a heroic uprising of the Palestinian people. No.
How can you tell the difference between the uprising from the Warsaw Ghetto and this? What makes it different?
Well, the Allies won, and the Allies were always going to win. And if the Nazis had won, then the Warsaw Ghetto would not be a heroic uprising, would it?
No, I guess not.
Right.
Maybe underground it would be. As the struggle continued.
If the Nazis won.
Yeah. And the dissidents would go underground, and we would secretly talk about that one time. And
what is this? What is this nonsense?
I mean,
Can I just?
We are living in an Orwellian world, and so again, it's kind of like, how do we think about this? And
this is not Marxist thinking at all. And also, the guy is he's contradicting himself, because he's saying we get lost in the rhetoric, but he's the one who's following the rhetoric. He's not following the money, other than to say, like, officially they don't give money to the settlements. Yeah, but there's such a thing as money laundering in imperialist states, right? They know damn well money is being funneled to the settlements.
Well, the settlements
and they're enabling that for decade after decade after decade.
Yeah. And a lot of the settlers are U.S. citizens.
Exactly. It's not illegal to join a settlement and then come back and forth between the U.S. and Israel.
And this is like people who try to, God bless them, when they talk about it with international losses. And I understand why there's, even if it's toothless or mostly toothless, why you want to couch your argument in that if you can. But he's saying, like, well, we don't support the settlements and all this stuff. And it's like, so do you mean to tell me that all the military stuff would go under, like none of it enters in any settlement ever? Bullshit.
If they're against the settlements, why do they declare some of the settler groups to be terrorist groups? Also, they qualify by the standards.
It's also like saying the war on drugs. Okay, like there's places, you have all kinds of official rules, but de facto, it's a different situation and highly negotiable. So it's laughable. They know that they have to say, we know that because they know that for most people, even people who support Israel in principle, or like who would say like Israel, it's the state of Israel has a right to exist and all this stuff. Most people have an issue with illegal settlements. So both parties for a long time, maybe not, probably Trump wouldn't, but would have to say it. Of course, where there should be no new settlements. They have to say that, but wink, wink. They keep on going on. It's not that they don't know what's going on. It's not that they've ever once really seriously done anything about it. So it's like, and that's one of the reasons why, of course, the people in Palestine realize the United States is never going to be even halfway of an honest broker between this process. No, because they let it get away with anything and let cover for them and make them out to be the victim. And this idea that I would agree with him, of course, that if to the victor goes things. So if Hamas is quote unquote annihilated and whatnot or whatever, okay, fine. This was again 1 week later, so now maybe they would say something else. But the horrific, I don't need to tell you this, but basically the genocidal thing that we're watching going on, people like going crazy, watching this go on in real time, not because more people have to be there. And then at the same time, our leaders and the media lie to us, like gaslight us 24/7. It's like, ah! So this, it could just go
into nothing. It's mind-fucking.
But the idea that, and also this, he's still buying the Israeli line about what happened on that day. He's saying this is a terrorist attack, just went there and killed a bunch of people. Whereas Scott Ritter has been a long article where he basically says it was a military raid and a very successful one, a very well-planned successful one. Were there civilian casualties? Yeah, there's always going to be civilian casualties. That's terrible. Whether or not they were trying, there's a difference between, of course, if you're dead, you're dead. But in terms of how we adjudicate that, if it was like going out of your way to do that, or shit happens when you're fighting a war or resisting an occupation or carrying one out, not risk-free exercising. But But I know you have to leave in 8 minutes. We only made it through 24 minutes. We didn't get into the best part when he was talking about, again, my favorite part when he said just matter of factly that it's well known that, that Hamas has to meth up their, young soldiers so they can go out and, carry out these atrocities. Which he
Well,
claims
even if they did, they would hardly be the only military in the world that does that.
Well,
like,
yeah,
I'm sure if you looked into, you define the IDF, like many, if not most militaries in the world, like to juice up their soldiers before they go into battle.
Yeah, usually any kind of frontline, I'm sure even drone operators have to self-medicate a lot of them unless they've totally been able to detach themselves from it. But as far as there's a reason why a lot of people came back. I remember my dad's generation, people that came back from Vietnam. A lot of them, of course, had post-traumatic stress, but a lot of them were addicted to heroin, all kinds of things. So the idea,
lots of accounts that the officers encouraged that.
Yeah. So it's unfortunate, or maybe not, but again, it's just Cutrone goes on and he's talking about what happened on October 7th. This basically just seems to have bought the CNN line, hook, line, and sinker. We didn't get to some of the more political part. I don't know if it's so I know you have to go. We could always collaborate on a Substack rebuttal to this podcast to the rest of the Left, Hamas, and Socialism podcast. If you are interested, I'd be willing to do that. Or if we're just we can just leave it here and people can, we can just wrap it up because I know we've almost been going on. You only have about 60 minutes before you have to exit. But we can talk about that.
I really appreciate the invite, and it's been great. Let me just say my last comment. This is why I really don't. What we just heard, this is why I don't trust these people anymore, because it's so slippery and contradictory, and it's one of the last. He's bringing in Hegel, and it's Hegel was not a Marxist, though, right? It's he influenced him in terms of the dialectics and stuff, but you're just analyzing the basic situation here, right? So you're supposed to be sticking to materialism, and Hegel was an idealist. There's nothing Hegel can say that's valuable to this type of analysis. It's just a distraction. It's
well, and to be fair, I get the idea before that I think that one of the things that happens also, and I, if this podcast takes off, maybe I'll find the same problem. That if you find yourself wanting to do a show 2 or 3 times a week, and you have to come up with content. So it's idea they have the Cutrone zone. This thing happened in Israel. They decide to have this topic, and I don't get the impression that he was had taken much time to organize his thoughts about it. So it could have just been in real time. But then you should mention that. I think you're going to be honest, and to be honest, you should mention that because he's passing himself off like he's some sort of expert on this.
Right. Well, we didn't even get into the distorted Lenin quote.
No, this is what I thought, Garrett, and this is what I was thinking when I was how stupid was I to think we were going to get through this and then also talk about your article.
Right.
That's not going to happen. We can always. I would be fine because I was so, as you can see, I'm still triggered by this episode.
Right.
So we can certainly have a part 2, and then now that we remembered that we can fast forward the audio, we can do that, or we can do something offline as well, for a Substack if our writing styles dovetail enough. But yeah, and I think also just if I have one slide here that maybe I'll, if I can find it. Yeah, so in terms of my main criticisms, it just seems and he didn't bring this up, but I have to wonder sometimes of people who've never had to actually engage in or their parents had to deal with armed struggle. But I think it's really hard for people who've never been in that situation or can't imagine themselves in that situation to deal with that. So it's almost like, okay, if nonviolence doesn't work, then you just have to, suffer and die quietly, kind of. Because if you do engage in armed struggle, of course, they're immediately going to be called, people who they're opposing, they're going to be called terrorists. Most of the media will probably take that in line. And then even though the left is saying that, apparently aren't bothered by that, and they're saying they took up the Hamas flag almost, that hasn't been my experience. I haven't seen that anywhere in the UK, or at least. It's a bit odd. And this kind of, again, this kind of cultural chauvinism. You mentioned this a bit, when you get the kind of idea like, well, the Arabs, nationalism failed and this and that. And it's kind of, I don't know, that I just kind of got a sense of that, which of course I'm not in his mind, so I don't know. And again, just a lot of talking out of the ass there. And we didn't get to the nitty gritty, but when some of the other things he mentioned, especially when he was trying to talk about later on, somehow that a boss is a kind of serious leader of the Palestinians. And also just in terms of the left, I don't think you can be, I think one of the things, I know there's like socialist left, and there's, democratic socialist left, and there's communist and capitalist, all kinds of varieties of things on the left. But I think that one of the main things is if you're anti-imperialism, I'm just like, please. And even that argument that's very relevant. Just to be against funding this, how is that not a left position? Whether or not, and the idea that somehow Hamas isn't a Leninist Marxist party, that somehow we don't care.
Right.
Somehow that's again a failure. They're not evolved yet. Like somehow they have to cook in the pot longer. I don't know. There's just a lot of things that really bothered me about this, but particularly because I had prior to this episode held Catrone in high regard, and now I'm a bit like maybe I.
Yeah, me too. In most
maybe,
respects, yeah.
Maybe it's only because I don't know enough about some of the stuff that he seems to present himself as knowing quite a bit to know. When you get into that kind of the Trotskyists and the Kostkys and the this and that, I'm like, okay, I'll take your, people who were called tankies and the Stalinists and all this. I'm just like, yeah, I don't know enough to know what that means. The connotation, like the denotation, yeah, but the connotation, I'm like, yeah, I don't know what all those mean. And that's another thing I'm going to ask you the next time we talk, if you can explain what it means when is it a dig to call someone a tanky or a trot or a tanky?
Yeah.
But not.
Well, I'll say a lot of the good. The problem with Cutrone, when I think about it, is a lot of the good points that he's made over the past year or so, I think were actually made by tankies earlier.
Okay.
It's like he's been out ahead of other Trotskyists, but I don't think he's been out ahead of the other of tankies actually. And whatever else you think about them, they were more correct about, say, the Ukraine war, and that was unwinnable. And that
but a tanky in 2023, is a tanky a Stalinist? Who are the tankies?
Yeah, basically
like Stalin, or just kind of like a neo-Stalin. I don't even know. I know who Stalin was.
Right. No, they generally
I know how that degenerated.
They like Stalin, and they respect socialism in one country, which is something which is a communist form of nationalism, which apparently Cutrone doesn't respect. He doesn't seem to respect any kind of nationalism. That's just
I'm pretty sure that they're saying that either socialism will be international or it won't be, and also it has to start in the States. That I know they.
Yeah, well, it has to start somewhere. Like, the whole world isn't going to go socialist all at one time. on top of which that wouldn't be democratic.
Quality
kind of like
measure thing.
you win over one country at a time when they, that's the real world. That's supposed to be non-utopian socialism that Marx stood for, as opposed to utopian socialism. Like socialism works in the real world. It's not the socialism where there's one big struggle and the whole world just flips to being socialist overnight. It's one nation at a time.
Okay. So no way to wrap up. I just want to say that this is not a cancellation campaign against Sublation Magazine or Catron Platypus. Although I would say, please, for the love of anything you hold dear, do not base your understanding of the situation in Israel-Palestine on Chris Catron. That I can say with 100% certainty. Do not let that be your only or main source.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I mean,
like I said, I have no direct evidence one way or the other. If he's a traitor, if he's a fed.
He's a Peter Dow. He's a Peter Dow, man.
Yeah.
So Platypus, Platypus was all a long game to.
But there's a failure. It's a failure. He's part of the failure of the left, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So the CIA. This is great. They had Doug Lane in their sights for a long time. This guy from PDX from Portland, and so that's why somehow their paths crossed. How did Doug Lane and Chris Catron come to know each other? Chicago. He's having some platypus things, which is for his school, basically like critical reading groups and teachings or something, I think. Which nothing wrong with that. Good God, I'm all for a good teaching and reading group. Don't get me wrong. But how, this begs attention. Someone needs to get on this. How hilarious. Just, we're joking, of course, mainly. Are we? Yeah, we don't know. But that'd be kind of hilarious. He's sent in to make sure that sublation doesn't sublate anything important, or a counter sublationist. Sorry, it's late here.
I would say counter DSA, counter Democratic Socialists of America, and put sublation in the same category as that. Because from what I see, I think that they're tailing.
Well, they did take a noble
because the DSA was tolerating pro-Palestinian stuff for a while, up until this summer, when the National Office of DSA purged the pro-Palestinian people. And that's because the DSA is just the left wing of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party, they can be anti-Zionist up until election year, right? where they're fundraising from the Zionists.
Yeah, they're now. They're taking away the endowments from the Ivy League. They've
Yeah.
Which I have to say, that was no one told the students they weren't supposed to take the decolonization stuff seriously. Only the syllabus. Yeah. You can only decolonize the syllabus. You can only remove.
Well, as I like to say, cultural nationalism is okay, but not revolutionary nationalism.
Ooh, well, good segue.
So they're doing cultural decolonization, not the real thing.
There you go. Good segue, which is the topic of. Let me show that again before we end here, because I have to get good when
That's what Fred Hampton was trying to warn us about.
Yeah, so I have to get that back up there. Sorry. Oh, here we go. Yeah. So
yeah, and the link is in the chat.
Okay, so let's see. What are the lessons? This is the Morbid Symptoms podcast, and the morbid symptom today was Chris Catron's assessment of the Israel-Palestine on Sublation Media, and what that we didn't get to say too much about. We did touch on it off and on what that meant broader, not just in terms of Catron, but for the left, quote unquote. Such as it is, that exists mainly only in our mind, I think, not as a material force much. Anyway, so my special guest was Garrett Ramirez, and I want to thank him for coming on this new startup while we're still figuring out the tech and how everything works. He's going to be back.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you I really appreciate it. It was fun. revived, man, revived. Let's see. What do I want to say? Yes. So again, on the Twitter feed, I'll be putting out a promo when Garrett's going to come back, and we're going to go into a deep dive to his recent social populist Substack article on that starts off with Cornel West and Jimmy Dore. So there was, for those of you who don't know, there was a heated exchange, and he's going to tie it back historically, going back to the differences between Fred Hampton and Stokely Carmichael, to give us kind of the historical backdrop of what he's calling cultural nationalism, and how it's I don't know, is an obstacle or still something that we have to deal with when it comes to a more revolutionary.
I would say that the true roots of wokeness.
Okay. Cliffhanger, Garrett.
The sort of identity politics perversion of revolutionary impulse.
Okay, identity politics, perversion, subversion of revolutionary impulse, going back to Stokely Carmichael and Fred Hampton. So, you guys are going to want to tune in for that. I'll be promoting it. Garrett, thank you very much. And hey, hopefully this is the first of several collaborations, shall we say. Comrades.
Definitely.
All right, take care. Thank you, Garrett. Bye, everybody.
Have a great night.
See you next time.